Hi. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Johanna Braun and Professor Jennifer Brody and the faculty and students and staff of the Department of Theater and Performance Studies at Stanford University for making this event possible and especially for inviting me to be a part of it. This talk is called Terror, Contagion, and the Psychopathology of Empire on Black Conservative Histrionics. When Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron stood up in front of a black drape behind a walnut podium flanked by two requisite flags, announcing and defending the decision of a grand jury to charge none of the officers responsible for murdering Breonna Taylor in cold blood with homicide, the performance was markedly different from the one he delivered about 30 days earlier at the Republican National Convention. Speaking at the convention after he had callously splayed his strongman bona fides over the previous months, banning abortions, suing the Kentucky governor, and calling his COVID protection order scared and reckless, Cameron railed against Democratic presidential nominee and former Vice President Joe Biden, excoriating the radicals who dominate his party. You know, the ones who will cut you down if you speak freely, who are hysterical with the quote, politics of identity, cancellation, and mob rule. Back then, when he was flanked by even more and more erect flags, it was fists pumping at you, freshly shaped up head leaning side to side, questioningly, then accusingly at you, and of course, fingers pointing at you. It was a smiling stare at you and a head shaking shame on you for mindlessly tearing up American cities, you anarchist, you. At the RNC, Cameron's thesis was a defense of himself as a Black Republican, which required drawing on a history of representations of the Democratic Party as a plantation that has objectified Black voters and taken us and our leftward leans for granted. The slow oscillation of the neck was the same in both speeches, though, a punctuation after each pontification about our better angels and about the demon mobs in the street in the RNC speech, and a punctuation for each assertion of the law's infallible objectivity in the Breonna Taylor speech. Also similar and yet very different were the histrionics Cameron brought to his emphatic insistence on his own racial identity. First, "Look at me," he says behind the MAGA podium, hands fanning from his heart toward the podium, as if holding out not his skin but his black heart. Quote, "I am black. We are not all the same. We are not in chains." He points to his temple, then at Joe Biden when he says, "My mind is my own, and you can't tell me how to vote because of the color of my skin." He shakes his head judgingly, defiantly, fuck youingly. Then, in the second instance, a reporter asks Cameron to speak to the Black people who might say, "This is just another example of the Black community not getting justice. Do you understand the pain?" she asks. He looks down at his papers, caressing them. He avoids eye contact. He overuses the passive voice as he refers to the pain that has been brought upon by the tragic loss of Miss Taylor. He sweeps his hand to the right as he gestures to his jurisdiction as the Attorney General, indicating just how vast his understanding of Black pain is. Yeah, it is 120 Kentucky counties wide. Then he looks up at the reporter and says, "I understand that as a Black man." He uses his hand upon saying this to make a chopping motion towards the reporter. "Black chop man." "How painful," he nods, then pauses, then fiddles with his papers again, then maybe tears up, then completes the sentence. "This is." He chokes and before going on to point out how hard the investigators worked to come up with no evidence other than that suggesting that the wall of Breonna Taylor's neighbor was in greater danger than the woman whose body absorbed 6 bullets. The tears Cameron shed during his press conference this afternoon were a lie, wrote Damon Young that day. They were also an audition. The audience he was performing for witnessed both the sort of hollow empathy Pecksniffian conservatives wield to feign humanity and Cameron's ability to perform it under pressure, showing them that he's their huckleberry, the great Black Republican hope, best in class. Cameron's Black histrionics affected the now familiar move of making Black protest that is always already blackened, appear hysterical. The protester hysteric in right-wing histrionics is a figure for a leaky femaleness spreading itself all over the body politic, a figure for emotional excess and runaway expenditure to be tamed and put back in place. A bumper sticker I just saw read, "Trump 2020, make liberals cry." Liberal, hysterical you and your pussy hats. They won't forget how you marched your wandering uteruses into public squares with your pussies grabbing back at history. Radical, hysterical you with your memes and tweets and cardboard protest signs. They won't forget how you permanently canceled white supremacy. But taking up Johanna Braun's invitation to consider hysteria as a diagnosis of the performer. She notes, for example, that when hysteric was struck from the DSM-4, it was replaced with histrionic personality disorder, in effect rebranding the disorder of the wandering uterus as a disorder of theatricality. I want to begin by suggesting that the Blackness that surfaces in Cameron's speeches as histrionics, exaggerated dramatic behavior designed to attract attention, is a crucial point of contagion between racial terror and late imperial power. The lick of the lips as one pauses to consider just how painful it is to be Black and look at this, and then be the one to excuse this. The Black hardened Black hands pumping onto the convention stage. Blackness is the link between terror overcome and terror dispersed. Puffing Cameron up and later choking Cameron up, Blackness lives in the histrionic performance as the telltale sign not of race traitorism, but of a whole other racial formation. Cameron's bodily plea to see his Blackness was not simply, as Damon Young suggested, a performance of selling the race out for the keys to the Republican kingdom. It was it was also a sign of the intimacy between Blackness and U.S. statecraft throughout what I call the long war on terror and in its sick aftermath. In the psychopathology of late empire, Blackness is the necessary link, the engine of contagion between racial terror and racial protection. My goal in this presentation is to offer a bit of context for Cameron's performances of conservative Black histrionics by way of my own expertise in literary studies in particular, and in my recent research on Black women and the culture of U.S. empire. In my current work, I argue that an acute expression of the psychopathology of the Western empires has been the gory fascination with the bodies, spirits, motives, and movements of Black people. When it comes to those subjects who identify themselves as girls or women, or who were identified as female specimens or an ungendered property for reproductive use, this fascination has extended to, indeed subtended, the field of politics, where Black women have been imagined, pictured, and claimed not only as the hysterical threat to American democracy, but as the very proof of it. I argue that throughout what I call the long war on terror, the culture of contemporary empire building through the technologies of war, surveillance, and detention has transformed African American expressive culture as a social field. And I'm speaking here particularly of literature. The imprint of domestic and foreign counterinsurgency on Black women's writing in particular, at a time when the community of Black women writing became, in Hortense Spiller's oft-cited words, a vivid new fact of national life, was unmistakable in the clarity of both its inspiration, the blood spilled in Boston, Atlanta, Detroit, El Salvador, Guatemala, Lebanon, Nicaragua, Palestine, and Iraq in the name of North American security, and in its imperative to create and communicate ways of defending against what the US state was calling defense throughout the Long War on Terror. The Long War on Terror is the large-scale, multi-pronged campaign of counterterrorism that escalated during the late Cold War period against organizations deemed domestic terrorist threats, such as the Black Panther Party or the Black Liberation Army. Starting in 1968, I mapped the transformations of Black women's expressive culture against the campaigns of counterterrorism at home and abroad, beginning with COINTELPRO's efforts to contain Black radicalism and radical Black feminism, and proceeding through Reagan-era counterinsurgency and the wars in Iraq. If U.S. empire building throughout the Long War on Terror demanded a shift in racial gendered power, with Black women coming to occupy a central place in the late 20th century imaginary and iconography of global power, Condoleezza Rice might come to mind, or Michelle Obama later, Black feminist writers predicted and tracked that shift. More than that, they crafted ways of surviving it. So this is a story of state power at its most devious, at its most absurd, and at the same time, a literary history of Black feminist radicalism at its most trenchant. One of the texts I write about is Alice Randall's novel Rebel Yell, which draws an unorthodox line between Black protest and Black responsibility for the violence of early 21st century security and policing. In her post-civil rights epic, Randall's protagonist is Abel Jones, a civil rights dream child who turns away from his upbringing in Nashville, where he grows up as the son of a protest leader at the height of the movement. He becomes one of the world's most powerful agents of counterterrorism. Disgusted by his father, the civil rights leader, his father's softened, nonviolent civil rights masculinity, Abel prefers the hard armor of police force and torture, and state counterterror becomes the guarantor of his heteropatriarchal power. He becomes a political conservative, a spy, and a lexicographer at the Pentagon, where it is his job to author and guard what I call the imperial grammars of Blackness. He spends his days analyzing and stretching definitions of torture to protect the military's gross abuses of power at Abu Ghraib in the Philippines and in Martinique. Rather than figuring complicitous Black subjects as aberrant, deluded, self-hating Uncle Toms, Randall's novel presents them as the beloved sons and daughters of civil rights, the ones who weren't killed in combat, the ones who not only work in the White House, but who may very well be at home in Black spaces, barbershops, Black colleges, bars, soul food restaurants, etc. The attempts to reconstruct the life of Randall's disinherited messiah of civil rights begins when Abel's ex-lover Nicholas visits his ex-wife Hope after Abel's funeral. As the two former lovers forge an unlikely alliance, Nicholas, quote, took out a stack of photographs and laid them down on the table, as if he were playing eccentric solitaire, 3 rows of 3. The pictures, photographs were disturbing and familiar. Naked men, dogs, leashes, piles of bodies, simulated sex acts, a uniformed, smiling soldier, hoods, framed in a neat white border. Placing before Hope 9 photographs of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, Nicholas confesses that he fears he recognizes in them Abel's signature. Reproducing the images as photographs, quote, not beaming from a computer screen or glossy in a magazine, accomplishes the novel's task of bringing Black responsibility for racist violence, along with the images, closer as Randall writes, alarmingly close, and at the center of the novel's attempts to reconstruct Abel's life narrative from civil rights to the War on Terror. Gazing upon another photograph, this one of Abel standing in front of a flag, what looked to be his official White House or Pentagon portrait, Hope is finally able to, quote, put it all together. September 11th, waterboarding, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, Abel. Nicholas's and Hope's reunion is an attempt to reconfigure the pieces of Abel's life, even as it anchors the novel's attempts to reconstitute Black identity through its proximity to security and national identification, and by extension, to global counterinsurgency. The surfacing of the Abu Ghraib photographs in Rebel Yell captures the novel's fascination with the racial sexual life of counterterrorism. Nicholas's recognition of Abel's signature in the photo ties the dead man's racial shame to his fascination with torture. As Nicholas later reveals to Hope, Abel, quote, lusted for recognition like he lusted for big-bosomed, white-skinned, centerfold ladies. The specter of Abel's touch in the scenes depicted in the photographs and upon the photographs themselves is the mysterious, ghostly force that coheres the fractured plot of this post-civil rights epic, tying Abel's humiliating emasculation by white supremacists down south to his drive toward physical, political, and sexual domination as a spy and government operative. As Jasbir Puar argues, the U.S. exceptionalism that grounds performances of counterterrorism after 9/11, such as the performances of sexual domination and the images of torture at Abu Ghraib, attaches sexual competition to counterterrorism, such that the Orientalist production of the terrorist identifies terrorism as a form of queer deviance in need of correction, and at the same time frames the U.S. as a liberal homeland in which various forms of gender and sexual queerness are permitted and normalized. If the torture at Abu Ghraib was productive within the imperial modalities of U.S. warfare, that is, it was meant to coercively produce the Arab subject and the Arab mind, that's again quoting Puar, not just to shame or humiliate, we could see its surprise appearance in Rebel Yell as a narrative happening that draws Abel's imperial paranoia into view as a racial sexual crisis, linking U.S. racial slavery to post 9/11 security practice. Imperial paranoia is the term Anne McClintock uses to describe empire's capacity to discursively, quote, cohere as a collective community around contradictory cultural narratives, self-mythologies, practices, and identities that oscillate between delusions of inherent superiority and omnipotence and phantasms of threat and engulfment. When Hope remembers the frustration and anger that her former husband Abel feels when he reads that the deserting Confederate soldiers in the Civil War were punished with 39 lashes and a brand on the cheek, she wonders if Abel had, quote, translated that indignity into new sets of gestures, gestures he could misuse at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. This question of translation, the question that drives the novel, really the question is of the translatability of terror, brings the sexual life of the Confederacy into articulation with the sexual life of the war against terror, with Abel serving as the unlikely, quote, modern day Black Confederate who masterminds state violence in order to overcome the abjection of his childhood in Nashville. It is indeed his lust for recognition, for the conferment of humanity, which compels him from one side of terror to the other. Blackness is the point of contagion between terror survived and terror performed or dispersed. Abel experiences terror as both generational breach and intimate encounter. His 13th birthday is the episode that the novel cites as the primal scene of this breach/encounter. As an army of civil rights activists gathers for Abel's birthday in the Joneses' Nashville home, white supremacists set fire to a cross on the front yard. Terrified, Abel pees his pants and feels, along with the others, quote, the shame of all the dark, the pale dark, and the hard dark people around him, a shame intensified for the presence of a white witness to their humiliation. Singling out Abel's white friend Ben as the bearer of the white gaze that consumes Black humiliation, the novel tells the story as a clash of masculinities, a spectacle of castration after which neither Abel's father, the civil rights leader, nor Abel himself is ever the same. As the burning cross stands erect on the yard, Big Abel, the father, attempts to extinguish the fire with the garden hose, only to find it slashed. Big Abel's limp, disfigured garden hose, Little Abel's regression to soiling his pants, and the absurdist histrionics of a 6-foot-tall, 13-year-old Little Abel finding refuge in police power as he's scooped up into the arms of a white cop draw together the novel's matrix of racialized debasement, sexual competition, and refuge in national security. Describing Abel's flight to two white policemen, Randall writes, mistaking their disinterest for courage, he ran to stand in the sheltering space he imagined between their two bodies. The larger of the two men lifted him into his arms and cradled him like a baby. What connects the cross burning at the birthday party to the photos from Abu Ghraib is the signature, the mark of Abel's arrival at legibility within a political order secured by and structured in police violence. A legibility won by the performance of masculine bodily integrity designed to at once subdue and control hysterical femininity and project deviant femininity onto the Arab/Muslim other. The cross burning is a scene of visual subjection that locks Abel into his lifelong quest for a proper viewing, that lust for recognition that lands him in the Pentagon. The effect of the terror in Nashville is reflected in Abel's keen awareness of being visually apprehended by two subjects he desires, Ben, his white Jewish friend, and Sonia, a young Black woman from the Joneses' extended family. Ben, the white boy, Abel's best friend, symbolizes the world beyond Abel's enclave that his coming of age entitles him to. First, the birthday party, quote, felt significant, as if he was leaving his cradle friends behind and joining something bigger, the company of men, the world his white classmate Ben had been ushered into at the temple off Harding Road. Sonia is a beautiful young woman, older than Abel but younger than his parents, Abel's former babysitter, who symbolizes the erotic allure of Black upward mobility and intraracial gender hierarchy. Abel's father encourages Sonia's enrollment at the University of Tennessee because he, quote, wanted to torture Chattanooga with her existence, a fresh Black beauty just off the farm, whose daddy was a lawyer and whose uncle was a judge, and who was wholly unavailable to white men. Big Abel wanted those white boys. He wanted the white men to see this, to know this. He wanted Chattanooga to see Sonia and want Sonia and not have Sonia. Big Abel's lust for recognition materializes as a drive to make Sonia an object of desire and therefore torture. Little Abel, too, finds himself positioning Sonia as a coordinate in the triangulation of his lust for recognition by white power, here represented by Ben, or the police. He wanted to, quote, let Ben see again just how pretty she was. Interrupting this moment that projects the lustful desire to be seen through the manipulation of the Black woman's body as an object of white gazing is the cross burning that culminates in the castration and infantilization. Abel with slash hosed and soiled pants, cradling in the arms of a policeman. Caught limp and powerless rather than possessing and powerful, Abel's response is to fetishize the seeing penetrating power of the state. When Hope wonders if Abel had translated Confederate military practice into, quote, new sets of gestures he could misuse at Guantanamo, the novel identifies Abel as a subject of imperial grammar who updates the codes of racial subjection and counterterror. Hope learns that his job in the Pentagon was to parse the crazy definitions that allow for Abu Ghraib, to parse perpetual detainment. If Abel's job is to decide which forms of torture are permissible by attending to definitions in international law, he brings to that legal linguistic work an intense investment in the safety of defense. By the end of the novel, Hope recognizes with chagrin that it had, quote, leavened something in Abel's spirits to move from I am not safe to we are not safe to no one is safe. Abel's translations of white supremacist terror into torture in the War on Terror, and here of the first person subject of insecurity to the first person plural to the third person indefinite, mark safety as a zone of home and homeland protection. Abel translates the scene of civil rights masculinity overcome with humiliation into the imperial grammars of blackness, those maneuvers in language that tie the racial subjects having been overcome, and importantly, having overcome, to the nation's drive to overcome terror itself. At Abel's funeral, one of his friends remembers Abel's lifelong work of translating anti Black terror into anti Arab counterterror as a Gothic labor of those who survived what they were not meant to survive. Abel, like his other lover, the Condoleezza Rice-ish National Security Advisor Aria Reese, quote, was raised in a time and place of terror, a place of bombings and shootings, a place of funerals and wakes, a place of police dogs and fire hoses turned toward children, a land red with the blood of the recently slaughtered, a place where wedding bells didn't ring. If Aria Reese chooses to, quote, infect the nation with the anxieties of Black children who came of age in a time of terror when the war at home rocked their churches, so too does Abel's signature, the signature that authorizes Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, serve to animate the fiction of state safety in grammars of pain, vengeance, and overcoming. In this way, Rebel Yell probes the relationship between the performance of Blackness as terror overcome and the disbursement of terror, surveying how, as Cynthia Young suggests, Black abjection secures national absolution in a narrative rehearsal of the lethal necropolitics that defines our contemporary moment. And that was 10 years ago. To close, I want to return to my earlier point vis-a-vis the Kentucky Attorney General, that Blackness is the puff-up and the choke in performances of Black protection, that it serves as the point of contagion between terror overcome and terror dispersed. Black feminist expressive culture, however, has taken as one of its central motives deciphering the tracks between anti-Black terror and the operations of late and post-Cold War counterinsurgency, which have increasingly depended on Black loyalty to country, Black statecraft, what Gwendolyn Brooks decades ago referred to sneeringly as the government men with their pretty brown faces, to spread the fiction of democracy around the homeland and around the world in however choked up sentences of justification and with actual weapons of war. I want to refer us finally and perhaps somewhat predictably to Megan Thee Stallion, bare legs splayed open to signal both vulnerability and power, all contra more urgent protection in the midst of mass hysteria. Thank you.